Millionaire asked his son to choose a new mother among the four rich women. But he chose. The autumn light streams through the floor-to-ceiling windows of tech mogul Robert Sterling's Manhattan penthouse as 7-year-old Tommy sits surrounded by four elegantly dressed women who represent everything his father's social circle values: old money, pristine bloodlines, and the kind of refined beauty that charity galas celebrate, while real kindness remains invisible to eyes trained to measure worth through designer labels rather than character that adversity reveals, but that comfort never tests. Outside their gilded world, Maria Santos finishes her shift cleaning their building, her gentle humming echoing through empty corridors where she spent 3 years maintaining perfection that others inhabit while her own 8-year-old daughter waits at home. Homework spread across a kitchen table that doubles as desk in an apartment where love provides what money cannot: the security of being known, valued, and cherished for exactly who you are rather than what you might become, if properly molded by expectations that privilege mistakes for wisdom, when authentic nurturing requires seeing children as complete souls rather than potential investments in family legacy. Robert's selection process reflects business thinking applied to human relationships. His approach to finding Tommy's new mother following the same strategic methodology that built his empire through calculated decisions that prioritize outcomes over emotions, efficiency over empathy, results over genuine connection when love becomes transaction rather than transformation. When family becomes function rather than foundation that souls require for flourishing beyond material success that accumulation provides, but that meaning must create through relationships that serve humanity rather than just advancing advantages that wealth accumulates. But wisdom must guide if prosperity is to serve purposes greater than just personal advancement. The four candidates represent Manhattan's social aristocracy. Victoria Ashworth, whose pharmaceutical fortune spans generations, but whose interactions with children remain theoretical since nannies handled her own upbringing. Catherine Pemberton, whose real estate empire provides luxury, but whose emotional range never extended beyond corporate negotiations that merger expertise created, but that maternal instincts require developing through practice that privilege often prevents when staff provides. Care that parents should deliver through presence that money cannot substitute despite resources that convenience makes available when engagement becomes optional rather than essential for authentic relationships. Eleanor Blackstone brings old money elegance that finishing schools refined, but that genuine warmth never touched, when social position becomes performance requiring maintenance of image rather than expression of authentic self. Her contributions to children's charities providing tax benefits rather than personal satisfaction, when service becomes obligation that social standing demands, but that authentic care requires choosing rather than just scheduling, when duty creates distance that love must bridge if connection is to develop naturally rather than requiring negotiation that calculated relationships produce, when advantage matters more than affection. Sophia Whitman represents new money confidence, that technology success created through intelligence that business rewards, but that emotional intelligence requires different development, when professional competence cannot substitute for personal compassion. Her efficiency in managing corporate acquisitions contrasting sharply with uncertainty about managing 7-year-old emotions that logic cannot resolve through strategies that work for hostile takeovers, but fail when applied to bedtime. Stories that imagination requires rather than just expert analysis that experience provides through education that books contain, but that hearts must feel if authenticity is to emerge through connection rather than just competent performance. The interviews unfold with corporate precision that reveals more about candidates' discomfort with actual children than their suitability for motherhood. Each woman approaching Tommy with careful consideration for designer clothing that proximity to active child might damage. Their conversations focusing on educational advantages they could provide rather than emotional security that nurturing creates when presence matters more than presence, when attention exceeds accumulation as foundation. for relationships that flourishing requires despite material benefits that wealth can provide, but that love must animate if prosperity is to serve human development rather than just maintaining comfortable arrangements. Tommy observes each interaction with wisdom that children possess when adults underestimate their capacity for recognizing authenticity versus performance. His questions revealing depth that formal education hasn't taught, but that emotional intelligence develops naturally when circumstances require evaluation of human character through behavior that consistency demonstrates rather than words that strategy might craft to achieve desired outcomes when manipulation becomes tool rather than authenticity, serving as foundation for relationships that trust requires if connection is to survive testing that genuine affection welcomes, but that calculated interest cannot endure when pressure reveals true motivations. Maria's presence in their world exists through necessity rather than invitation. Her work maintaining environments that others inhabit while remaining invisible to occupants who benefit from her labor without acknowledging her humanity, except when service fails to meet expectations that entitlement creates around assumption that excellence should appear effortless because workers remain unseen despite competence that their roles require, when effectiveness demands skills that recognition might acknowledge, but that social barriers prevent appreciating when class creates distance that appreciation cannot bridge if prejudice maintains separation between those who serve and those who are served. Her interactions with Tommy developed naturally over months when elevator rides became opportunities for conversation that both found refreshing. Child seeking authentic adult attention that wasn't agenda-driven. Woman encountering young person whose curiosity remained uncorrupted by prejudices that adults typically display toward people whose circumstances suggest they don't deserve consideration despite character that observation might reveal if assumptions didn't create barriers around who merits respect regardless of employment that social position determines, but that human worth transcends when genuine interest replaces performed politeness. The conversations range from homework help that Maria provides while dusting furniture to cultural exchange that her Mexican heritage offers through stories that broaden Tommy's understanding beyond privileged bubble that wealth creates around experiences that money can purchase, but that authentic diversity must provide through relationships that genuine curiosity fosters rather than obligation, creating when natural interest develops between people whose circumstances differ but whose humanity connects when barriers dissolve through sustained interaction that mutual respect enables despite social distance that economics maintains, but that character can bridge. Tommy's questions about Maria's daughter Isabella create connection across economic divide that reveals how similar children's needs remain regardless of material circumstances. Both require attention, encouragement, and adults who see potential rather than just problems, who offer guidance rather than just judgment, who provide security through presence rather than just presence, when authentic care manifests through understanding that each child deserves recognition as complete person rather than project requiring improvement through methods that authority might impose, but that wisdom develops through relationship, that respect must foundation if growth is to serve individual flourishing rather than just conforming to expectations. The contrast between formal candidates' careful distance and Maria's natural warmth becomes apparent through Tommy's body language that changes dramatically when she enters spaces where he interacts with potential mothers. His shoulders relax, his questions flow naturally. His laughter emerges spontaneously rather than requiring encouragement that formal situations demand when performance replaces authenticity as behavioral expectation, when proper behavior becomes burden rather than natural expression, when relationships require negotiation rather than developing organically through shared experiences that genuine affection creates without strategic planning. Maria's own loss. Her husband's death 2 years earlier in construction accident that inadequate safety protocols caused created single motherhood that financial pressure makes challenging, but that love makes meaningful when purpose transcends circumstances to focus on providing security for Isabella despite obstacles that systematic inequality creates for families whose resources never match their dedication, when effort cannot overcome structural barriers that individual determination might address temporarily, but that collective action must eliminate if justice is to replace charity as society's response to needs that policy could address, but that tradition often ignores. The moment of truth arrives when Robert formally asks Tommy to choose among the four candidates. His expectation clear that selection will follow logical analysis of advantages each woman could provide, educational opportunities that connections create, social benefits that proper relationships establish, cultural refinement that appropriate influence develops, when upbringing serves advancement rather than authentic development, when family becomes vehicle for achieving status rather than sanctuary for becoming human, through relationships that nurture rather than just networking that serves strategic purposes, but that soul requires meaning rather than just accumulation. Tommy's response shocks every adult present when he articulates choice that innocent wisdom produces, but that sophisticated thinking cannot comprehend. "Daddy, I don't want any of them to be my mom. I want Maria to be my mom." His words create silence that revelation produces when truth confronts assumptions, when authentic preference challenges expectations, when child's clarity exposes adult blindness to values that matter more than advantages, when hearts recognize what minds might question, but that souls confirm through recognition that transcends rational analysis, to embrace truth that love reveals despite obstacles that logic might present. The reaction from the four candidates reveals character that crisis exposes when comfortable expectations get challenged by outcomes that preparation cannot anticipate. Their responses ranging from polite confusion to barely concealed horror at suggestion that working-class women could compete with their qualifications for role that social position should determine rather than emotional connection that child identifies as essential for relationships, that nurturing requires when authenticity matters more than appropriateness, when genuine care exceeds careful performance as foundation for family, that flourishing demands despite advantages that wealth might provide. Robert's shock at his son's choice forces confrontation with assumptions about appropriate relationships, that business thinking applies to personal connections. His worldview requiring reconstruction when beloved child's preference contradicts every criterion that logic suggests should determine suitability for motherhood, when heart recognizes qualities that resume cannot capture, when emotional intelligence identifies characteristics that credentials cannot measure, when authentic connection transcends circumstances that might suggest incompatibility, but that character bridges when genuine affection develops naturally rather than requiring negotiation. Tommy's explanation demonstrates wisdom that formal education hasn't taught, but that emotional experience develops when circumstances require evaluation of authentic human character. "Maria makes me feel safe. She listens when I talk about stuff that matters. She knows how to hug when I'm sad. She doesn't try to fix me or make me different. She just likes me the way I am. And she knows what it's like when people you love go away forever." His words revealing understanding of loss that connects their experiences across economic divide, that empathy bridges when authentic relationship develops through shared vulnerability rather than strategic alliance. The mention of loss, both Tommy's mother and Maria's husband, creates recognition of bond that grief forged when two souls found comfort in understanding that experience provides, but that explanation cannot convey. When shared sorrow creates foundation for healing that comfort zones never test, but that adversity reveals through strength that trauma can develop. When support provides safety for processing pain that isolation might make unbearable, but that connection transforms into wisdom that guides future relationships through understanding that suffering teaches, but that love applies when authentic care emerges from recognition that everyone deserves companionship through difficulties that individual effort cannot overcome alone. The silence that follows Tommy's declaration stretches across Penthouse like chasm between worlds, one where relationships require social approval, Another where hearts recognize authentic connection regardless of circumstances that might suggest incompatibility, but that character transcends when genuine affection develops naturally rather than requiring strategic calculation. When family becomes choice rather than just circumstance. When love recognizes value that economic status cannot measure. Despite advantages that wealth provides, but that meaning must create through relationships that serve souls rather than just advancing social position. Maria's presence becomes necessary as Robert processes implications of son's choice that challenges every assumption about appropriate family structure, class boundaries, and social expectations that privileged upbringing created around relationships that proximity should determine rather than economic differences that might complicate, but that authenticity can overcome when genuine care emerges through sustained interaction that mutual respect enables despite barriers that tradition maintains. But that courage might cross when connection proves stronger than convention despite obstacles that change inevitably encounters. Her reaction to Tommy's declaration combines shock with understanding when child's wisdom recognizes what adult sophistication might miss. That motherhood requires presence rather than just presence, attention rather than just advantages, authentic care rather than just strategic investment in human development that outcomes can measure, but that love must motivate if relationships are to serve flourishing rather than just maintaining arrangements that comfort provides, but that meaning requires. Creating through connections that money cannot purchase despite resources that convenience makes available when engagement becomes choice rather than just obligation. The conversation that follows transforms apartment from showcase of wealth into space where human relationships must navigate territory that preparation cannot map, when authentic connection challenges social barriers that tradition maintains, but that individual choice might overcome through courage that love provides when hearts recognize truth that minds might question, but that souls confirm through recognition transcending rational analysis to embrace possibilities that prejudice might deny. But that experience can validate when genuine partnership emerges despite circumstances that might suggest impossibility. Robert's business associates would view his consideration of Maria as romantic folly that threatened social standing. Their advice, predictably focusing on maintaining appropriate relationships that networking requires rather than authentic connections that souls need, their worldview unable to process genuine affection that develops across class lines when character matters more than credentials. When compatibility emerges through shared values rather than similar backgrounds. When partnership serves mutual growth rather than just strategic advancement that calculated relationships produce. When advantage matters more than authentic care that flourishing requires. Tommy's intervention becomes catalyst for examination of priorities that success can distort when accumulation becomes goal rather than tool, when social position matters more than personal happiness, when family serves image rather than providing sanctuary where authentic selves can emerge without performance that external expectations demand, but that love should eliminate through acceptance that genuine relationships create when understanding replaces judgment as foundation for connection. That children recognize naturally, but that adults must choose consciously when programming conflicts with authentic preference that wisdom might guide, if courage allows following hearts rather than just conforming to expectations. The weeks that follow Tommy's declaration create period of reflection that challenges everything Robert believes about family, society, and a relationship between wealth and worth when child's clarity forces examination of assumptions that success had never required questioning. When comfortable certainties must yield to possibilities that growth demands despite discomfort that change inevitably creates, when transformation requires abandoning familiar patterns that security provided, but that limitation enforced through boundaries that expansion must cross if evolution is to serve human development, rather than just maintaining static arrangements that tradition protects, but that progress might require challenging. Maria's gradual integration into their lives happens through practical arrangements that necessity creates. Tommy's increasing requests for her presence during homework, his preference for her stories over expensive entertainment, his emotional regulation improving dramatically when she provides comfort that formal caregivers cannot match despite professional training that techniques teach, but that authentic connection must animate if nurturing is to serve genuine development rather than just managing behavior through methods that compliance produces, but that flourishing requires inspiring through relationships that understanding creates rather than just authority that position provides. The opposition from Robert's social circle intensifies as word spreads about his consideration of relationship that challenges class boundaries they consider sacred. Their resistance revealing prejudices that politeness typically conceals, but that threat exposes when comfortable arrangements face disruption, that change represents despite benefits that transformation might provide, if resistance yielded to recognition, that authentic connection transcends circumstances that might complicate, but that character can navigate when genuine affection guides decisions that wisdom makes rather than just following expectations that tradition maintains, but that evolution might require abandoning. Isabella's introduction to their household creates sibling dynamic that Tommy had missed since becoming only child, their friendship developing naturally despite different backgrounds when play transcends economic circumstances to discover shared interests that age provides rather than advantages that wealth creates. Their interaction demonstrating how artificial barriers between children become when adult prejudices don't interfere with natural connection that curiosity fosters rather than suspicion that learned behavior teaches when fear of differences prevents recognition of similarities that humanity shares across divisions that society creates, but that hearts can bridge. The practical challenges of merging families across economic divide require adjustments that comfort zones never tested, but that authentic relationships must navigate when love creates willingness to accommodate differences that understanding can bridge despite obstacles that tradition might emphasize rather than connections that character can create when genuine partnership emerges through shared commitment to children's welfare, rather than just maintaining arrangements that individual preference might favor, but that family flourishing requires considering through perspectives that wisdom develops when hearts guide decisions rather than just protecting established patterns. Maria's influence on Tommy extends beyond emotional support into cultural enrichment that privileged education hadn't provided. Her Mexican heritage offering perspectives that diversify his understanding beyond narrow worldview that wealth often creates when comfort prevents exposure to experiences that authentic diversity requires through relationships that genuine curiosity fosters rather than obligation creating when natural interest develops between people whose circumstances differ, but whose humanity connects when barriers dissolve through sustained interaction that mutual respect enables despite social distance that economics maintains, but that character can bridge when authentic affection develops naturally. 2 years later, the Sterling household operates through different rhythms than wealth typically creates. Homemade meals replacing restaurant delivery, family game nights supplanting formal entertainment. Authentic conversation developing where polite performance once dominated when genuine relationships replace strategic networking as foundation for daily interaction that hearts require for flourishing despite material advantages that money provides, but that meaning must animate if prosperity is to serve human development rather than just accumulating comfortable arrangements that tradition might protect, but that growth requires challenging when evolution serves authentic development. Tommy's emotional development demonstrates benefits that authentic nurturing provides when presence matters more than presence. When attention exceeds accumulation as foundation for security that children require for healthy growth despite material benefits that wealth can offer, but that love must guide if resources are to serve human flourishing rather than just maintaining comfortable arrangements that privilege provides, but that purpose must direct through relationships that understanding creates rather than just authority that position establishes when power serves development rather than just maintaining control that fear might require, but that trust can eliminate. Isabella's adjustment to private school initially challenges both girls and institution as economic diversity creates learning opportunities that homogeneous environments cannot provide. Her academic excellence, surprising teachers whose expectations had correlated achievement with economic background rather than recognizing capability that exists everywhere, but gets acknowledged only when opportunity meets preparation regardless of packaging that might suggest inadequacy, but that character reveals through performance that merit measures rather than circumstances that prejudice might use for evaluation when bias influences judgment, that objectivity should govern. Maria's transformation from housekeeper to wife and mother demonstrates growth that opportunity enables when authentic support provides foundation for development that circumstances had previously prevented despite capability that always existed but never received recognition that position could provide. Her natural intelligence, finding expression through responsibilities that challenge competence while nurturing qualities that adversity had developed, but that security allows flourishing when safety creates space for authentic self-expression that fear might have prevented during survival mode, that economic pressure creates. Robert's business associates eventually accept changes that results validate when family happiness improves dramatically despite initial resistance to arrangements that tradition questioned, but that effectiveness confirms through outcomes that individual fulfillment and collective harmony produce when authentic relationships replace strategic networking as foundation for personal life, that meaning requires despite professional obligations that success demands, but that balance must maintain if accumulation is to serve purposes greater than just individual advancement that isolation might achieve, but that connection makes worthwhile. The millionaire who asked his son to choose among rich women learned that wealth cannot purchase wisdom, that children possess naturally when hearts recognize authentic connection despite barriers that society creates around assumptions about appropriate relationships. When love transcends circumstances that might complicate, but that character can navigate when genuine affection guides decisions that courage makes rather than just following expectations that comfort protects, but that growth requires challenging when transformation serves authentic development rather than just maintaining familiar arrangements that tradition preserves, but that evolution might require abandoning for possibilities that hope can envision if faith allows following truth that souls recognize, even when minds might question, but that experience confirms through relationships that serve humanity rather than just advancing advantages that accumulation provides, but that meaning must create through connections that transcend barriers to discover love that exists everywhere when hearts remain open to recognition, that authentic partnership can emerge between any souls whose character connects despite circumstances that might suggest incompatibility, but that understanding bridges when genuine care develops naturally rather than requiring negotiation that calculated relationships demand when strategy matters more than authenticity. If this story moved you, maybe it's time to examine the barriers we create around who belongs in our families and communities, to recognize that children often see truths that adult sophistication obscures, to understand that authentic relationships can emerge across any circumstances when character connects despite differences that society might emphasize rather than similarities that humanity shares when hearts remain open to possibilities that prejudice might deny, but that experience can confirm. If it is choose authenticity over expectation, character over circumstances, love over logic when building relationships that serve souls rather than just advancing advantages.